one of the problems with the legislation is that it's a non sequitur. The legislation that came out of the Newtown massacre is about universalizing background checks. That's the main item. The assault weapons we'll put to the side for a second. But that legislation would not have stopped the massacre in that elementary school. Adam Lanza's mother owned these weapons legally. She stored them in her house. Her son killed her, took the weapons, shot the people. Yeah. So one of the problems in convincing people that this legislation should be passed is convincing them that it would be useful, or that it's a reaction. It's trying to fix the problem that we saw in Connecticut.
That's been a challenge that's existed on this issue for decades. Is everybody, nobody has kind of the short-term memory to, remember how that kind of arc plays out. We all feel like, this tragedy is it, and it's so utterly heartbreaking that we have to do something about it. But that inevitably fades with the headlines. Sympathy runs incredibly deep. But it's narrow, and in order to succeed, we have to demonstrate that this issue is much more than about the sympathy that we have and that we genuinely feel toward victims of gun violence. And I say that personally, by the way, I should point out, for those who don't know, as a victim of gun violence. And that's been, my brother was shot in a shooting that happened on top of the Empire State Building in 1997. It was a tragedy that made front page headlines. And from the very beginning, I remember feeling uncomfortable about the inequity of compassion that existed around what happened to my family versus the 30,000 gun deaths that occur every year in our country. And we have to reframe this issue as, yes, Newtown was a catalyst, but it can't be, it's as it relates to kind of the desire to create change and the activity around it, it's a sugar high. It's not, we need to build this movement around a much more basic desire to make this a safer country.
But you're not answering my question, and my question is, why is the legislation that you got behind a non sequitur of legislation?
Right.
I mean, why don't you
attack
the problem that we saw in Connecticut?
Because that isn't the basic problem that we face in America. It goes back to, I guess I kind of answered your question indirectly. Newtown does not exemplify the most significant, if our goal here is to make this the safest nation it can possibly be, to prevent the most possible gun deaths, we don't, those tragedies get attention because they're anomalies. So we've taken a very careful look at this issue, and we look at it purely from the perspective of how we can save the most lives. Otherwise, it's part of that sugar high. If the numbers aren't there to bear it out, if the genuine opportunity isn't there to bear it out, how can you expect to keep the American public engaged?
Maybe I'm not making myself clear because you're used to having me come at you from the right, but what I'm doing right now is coming at you from the left and saying, one of the problems is that this guy had access to an armory that his mother had built, right? And most Americans would probably say, I don't know if a lady in Connecticut needs to have however many semi-automatic rifles in her house with large clips. And so what I'm getting at is, why don't you, in reaction to Newtown, push for something stronger?
I feel like I'm answering your question. You just don't want to accept it. I feel
that
like
I don't want to accept it. You don't want to accept it. I'm not accepting it.
Right. These are the spirited conversations that we have on the phone.
This ain't nothing yet. This ain't nothing. Wait till he calls me an ignorant slut.
I might be able to vouch for half of that.
It's true. I'm a terrible slut.
That's not. Background checks is big. That's been an incredible irony to the conversation that came out of Newtown, that the idea of background checks, the idea of making it impossible or less likely that 40% of all gun sales in our country go without the simple questions to verify a background. We can demonstrate the huge impact from a policy perspective that would have on preventing gun violence and saving lives. And what you're talking about with Mrs. Lanza, I also think there's a big opportunity to address that, but we actually think that there's another, and this is where there's a huge opportunity. I don't necessarily think it's a policy conversation, though, regarding the 300 million guns that are out there. And I've kind of been avoiding to go there because I know you want to go there in this conversation. But that's how I suggest we deal with that part of it. From a policy perspective, I contend unequivocally that the most constructive thing that we can do is keep guns out of the hands of the people that we all agree shouldn't have them, including law-abiding gun owners believing that, criminals, convicted felons, domestic abusers, and we can quantifiably show how that will prevent gun violence.